The cold came early to Harlan's Crossing that autumn of 1887. It came the way it always did in the Black Hills of Dakota Territory, not as a sudden assault, but as a slow withdrawal. First, the warmth left the nights. Then it left the afternoons. Then by the middle of October, it had abandoned the days, entirely retreating somewhere beyond the jagged western peaks, leaving behind a sky the color of a whetstone, an air so thin and sharp it caught in the back of your throat like the taste of iron. The town itself sat in a shallow valley between two long ridges of pine-covered hills, a collection of perhaps 200 souls who had come west for reasons as varied as the men and women themselves. Some had come for silver, some had come for land, some had come simply because there was nothing left behind them, and west was the only direction that still held the shape of a promise. They had built their town with the timber that surrounded them, and the timber was good. Thick-girthed ponderosa pines, straight, grained, and strong, that split cleanly along the long axis and stacked into walls that could hold the weight of a Dakota winter. They knew the cold. They respected it the way you respect a river, not with fear exactly, but with the constant low-level awareness of a man who has seen what happens to those who forget it is there. Stellan Voss understood the cold better than most, or so he believed. He was 52 years old, a big man, gone somewhat thicker in the middle than his younger self would have allowed, with hands that told the entire story of his life without a single word being spoken. The knuckles were enlarged, the skin calloused to something closer to leather than flesh, the fingers permanently curved from decades of gripping tools that shaped wood and stone into shelter. His father had been a carpenter in the German settlements of Minnesota. His grandfather had been a carpenter before that somewhere in a small town east of Stuttgart that Stellan had never seen and could barely picture. The knowledge of wood, its grain, its weight, its tendency to expand and contract with moisture and cold, was not something Stellan had learned so much as inherited the way you inherit the shape of your jaw or the color of your eyes. He had arrived in Harlan's Crossing 11 years ago with a young wife named Nora, a set of tools and a reputation that had preceded him by way of two Swedish ranchers who had employed him in the valley to the north. He had built 16 homes in those 11 years. 16 homes, 2 commercial buildings, a church, and a schoolhouse. Every structure still standing, every roof still sound. In a territory where bad winters killed livestock and men with equal indifference, where the ground heaved with frost and the wind found every gap in a poorly built wall, Stellan Voss had built things that held. This was not a small thing. This was everything. On the 5th of November, 1887, Stellan stood before the newest addition to his legacy. The Jensen house sat on a flat piece of ground at the eastern edge of town, and it was by any measure of the craft a fine piece of work. The walls were 8 inches of solid pine, the joints cut with a precision that left no gap larger than the thickness of a fingernail. The stone fireplace dominated the main room, 4 feet across at the mouth, built from creek stone, mortared with such care that it would outlast every man alive who had ever looked at it. The hearth was deep and wide, engineered to accept large logs and draw cleanly, the chimney rising a full 18 feet to pull smoke with authority up and away from the house. Stellan walked the perimeter slowly, the way a man walks a field after harvest, with the particular satisfaction of having extracted something from the raw material of the world. He checked the window frames. He tested the door on its iron hinges. He pressed his palm against the corner joint of 2 exterior logs and felt nothing. No give, no cold seeping through, no hairline gap that the wind could find and widen. It was a good house. It was the kind of house that 40 years from now, some grandson of Jensen's would still be living in, taking the walls for granted, the way children always take for granted the things their grandfathers built. That was the nature of good work. It disappeared into the ordinary. It became the ground under your feet. Stellan allowed himself one quiet moment of satisfaction, the way a man does when the thing he has made matches the thing he imagined. Then he pulled his coat tighter against the November air and turned to walk back toward the center of town. It was then that he saw Harwick Fitch. Fitch was the Dakota Territorial banksman in Harlan's Crossing, a position he occupied with the particular joylessness of a man who has confused employment with identity. He was thin, precise, with a face that seemed permanently arranged into an expression of mild administrative regret, as though the world consistently failed to file the correct paperwork. He rode a gray horse and carried a leather satchel, and he was currently dismounting in front of the Howell property on the north side of the main track. The Howell house was smaller than the Jensen house, smaller than most houses in Harlan's Crossing, if Stellan was honest. It had been built by a man named Edwin Howell, a Welsh miner who had arrived 4 years ago with a quiet wife, a persistent cough, and the kind of concentrated intelligence that showed in his eyes even when his mouth said nothing. Stellan had offered to help with the construction, but Howell had politely declined. He had felled and milled his own timber, laid his own foundation stones, worked in the evenings, and on weekends after his shifts at the mine. It had taken him 2 full seasons to complete. He had not lived long enough to see a third winter in it. The lung sickness had taken Edwin Howell in the spring of 1887, the same slow drowning that took miners across the territory, their lungs gradually filling with the fine dust of a world they had spent their lives tearing open. He had died in the bed he had built in the house he had built, surrounded by the few things he and his wife had carried across an ocean from a green valley in Wales. His wife had stayed. Maren Howell was 38 years old, dark-haired, with eyes the particular gray-green of deep water, and a stillness about her that people in Harlan's Crossing had variously interpreted as grief or pride, or simply the natural reserve of a woman from somewhere else. She had no family in the territory. She had no income beyond what small work she could find in town, mending, baking, helping at the church. And she had the debts Edwin had left behind, the debts of a sick man who had spent his last months unable to work, borrowing against a future he would not have. Stellan stopped walking. He watched Harwick Fitch remove a folded document from his leather satchel. He watched him walk to the door of the Howell house. He watched him tack the document to the wood with 2 small nails driving them, with the businesslike efficiency of a man performing an administrative function, rather than an act that would end someone's world. He watched Maren Howell standing a dozen yards away, a single wooden crate at her feet. She was not crying. That was the first thing Stellan registered, and it stayed with him. He realized in that moment, he had expected to see a woman weeping or arguing or pleading with Fitch in some way that would require bystanders to look away out of a combination of sympathy and the particular discomfort of witnessing private grief made public. He had expected something that would allow him to feel sorry for her from a comfortable distance. Instead, Maren Howell was simply watching. She stood with a stillness that was almost architectural, like a post sunk deep into the ground. Her hands were at her sides. Her face was composed, not blank, but composed the way a face looks when the person behind it has already finished the emotional calculation that other people are still running. Fitch said something to her. Stellan was too far away to hear the words, but he recognized the gesture, a vague wave toward the east, the direction of elsewhere, the direction of someone else's problem. Then Fitch walked back to his horse mounted and rode off without looking back. Maren stood still for a long moment after he had gone. Then she looked down at her right hand. Stellan saw her remove something from her finger. Even at this distance, even in the flat gray November light, he recognized the gesture for what it was. She held the ring in her closed fist for several seconds, not looking at it, just feeling its weight. Then she placed it in the front pocket of her coat. She did not look at the house. She bent, lifted the wooden crate, and began to walk. Not toward town, away from it. Up the long slope of the northern ridge into the pines, into the darkening afternoon, without a backward glance at the home her husband had built with his own hands and his own slow years. Stellan watched her go until the pines took her. Then he looked back at the Jensen house, at its sound walls, its careful joinery, its reliable stone hearth, and felt for the first time in many years something he could not quite name. It was not guilt. He told himself it was not guilt. He had no obligation to the Howell widow. He barely knew her. Their acquaintance consisted of occasional exchanges in the general store, a brief conversation at the church social. The previous summer, Edwin's polite declining of his offer to help with the construction. He owed her nothing. He told himself this with the practiced efficiency of a man who is very good at building walls of all kinds. Then he walked home. Nora was at the stove when he came in, and the house smelled of wood smoke and salt pork, and his 2 children were at the table, Birch 8 years old, and already built like a smaller version of his father, and little Fern 6, who had her mother's dark eyes and a laugh that could fill a room and empty it of trouble. Stellan sat in his chair by the hearth, the great stone fireplace that he had built himself in the first year of this house's life, and he let the warmth of it push the cold out of his bones. He did not mention Maren Howell to Nora. There was, he told himself, nothing to mention. Outside, the first snow of the season began to fall. Small flakes, tentative, more of a suggestion than a commitment. By morning it would be gone and the ground would be cold and bare, and waiting the way the Dakota hills waited for everything with impatience so vast and indifferent it could be mistaken for mercy. Maren Howell found the old cellar just before full dark. She had known it was there. Edwin had found it 3 years ago on one of his off-day walks through the northern hills, a habit he had kept from the Welsh valleys, the habit of a man who spent his working life underground, and found perhaps counterintuitively that the best rest he knew was to keep walking into the earth on his own terms. He had come home that evening with his eyes bright in the particular way they got when he had discovered something, when some piece of the world had revealed a principle he had not seen before. "There is a spring cellar up on the North Ridge," he had told her, spreading his hands on the kitchen table the way he always did when he was about to explain something. "Abandoned. Whoever dug it gave up years ago, but the structure is sound fieldstone arch, good drainage line. And Maren," he had paused, "the temperature in there, even in July when the surface is roasting, it stays cool. Constant. The earth is holding it." She had listened as she always listened to Edwin, not passively but with the focused attention of someone who understood that this man's observations were worth the effort of understanding. He had a gift that was rare in any man, and rarer still in a man who had spent his life doing physical labor, the ability to see principle in the particular, to look at a specific thing and understand what general truth it demonstrated. It was a gift she had fallen in love with before she fell in love with him. Now standing at the entrance of the cellar in the November dusk, a thin crust of new snow beginning to settle on the pine needles around her, she pulled his journal from the crate and held it against her chest for a moment before she went inside. The entrance was a low arch of fieldstone, barely 4 feet high, almost completely obscured by a tangle of overgrown hawthorn and wild raspberry canes that had spent years claiming the hillside for their own. She had to bend nearly double to get through, pushing aside the whip-thin branches, with her forearm pulling the crate behind her. Inside was darkness and the smell of deep earth, a clean mineral smell very different from the rotten damp of a surface ditch. The floor was packed dirt, hard as stone from decades of compression. The walls were earth and rock, the fieldstone arch, holding its shape with the stubborn, structural logic of the arch, the same logic that held cathedral ceilings 1,000 years after the men who built them had turned to earth themselves. She could not see the dimensions in the dark. She crouched and felt them with her hands, perhaps 12 feet deep, 8 feet wide. The ceiling low enough that she would have to move carefully but high enough to stand if she stayed toward the center. Small, dark, smelling of the past. Outside, the wind was beginning to build. She could hear it in the pines overhead, that long, searching sound that meant the temperature was dropping. Inside, it was not warm, but it was not what the outside was either. It was something different. The wind did not reach her here. The cold had a different quality still and settled the absence of heat rather than the presence of its opposite. Edwin had said this years ago about the deep levels of the mines back home in Wales. He had said the earth has a long, slow breath. The seasons forget themselves down below. What the surface experiences as violent swings of hot and cold, the deep earth absorbs and averages and returns as something steady and moderate. The rock does not know January from July. It only knows the long accumulated memory of 10,000 years of sun. She set her crate down. She wrapped herself in the wool blanket. She placed the cast iron skillet beside her, a useless weapon she had brought anyway because a useless weapon is still something to hold. And she opened Edwin's journal by the thin gray light that leaked through the cellar entrance, and she began to read. His handwriting was the same as it had always been, compact and deliberate, the script of a man who had taught himself to read and write at an age when most boys had already been in the mines for 2 years, and who had therefore never lost the conviction that written words were worth the effort of forming carefully. The early pages were mining notes, observations on rock strata, calculations for ventilation shafts, drawings of timber supports, the dry technical record of a man's working life. Then about a third of the way through, his focus shifted. The drawings became different. Instead of the standard upright shafts and box frame supports of conventional mining diagrams, Edwin had begun sketching something horizontal, long, low tunnels stone-lined with careful notations about airflow and surface temperatures, and what he called, in his Welsh-inflected engineering shorthand, the principle of thermal transfer. He had drawn the same concept over and over, refining it across a dozen pages, each iteration a little more precise, a little more confident. And beneath one particular diagram, a long, low tunnel leading from a small firebox at one end to a vertical pipe at the other, he had written a phrase and underlined it twice. The smoke must pay rent. Marin sat with the journal in her lap and listened to the wind in the pines overhead and felt the steady cold of the earth around her, that particular cold that was not moving, not searching, not hunting, anything. And she let the idea take shape in her mind, the way a form takes shape when you are looking at it in dim light. Slowly, from all sides, without forcing it. It took most of the night. By the time the pale morning light began to filter through the cellar entrance, she had the outline of it. Not the details would require tools and stone and days of hard physical labor, but the principle, the logic, the reason it would work. She stood up slowly, her joints protesting the cold and the hard ground, and she looked at the earthen walls around her, at the hundreds, the thousands of tons of earth and rock pressing gently in from all sides. She thought about what Edwin had understood about the deep earth, that it was not a passive backdrop, that it was a system, that it processed heat the way a river processes water, slowly in volume across time, smoothing the peaks and filling the troughs. These walls were not a liability. These walls were the most valuable thermal resource within 20 miles of Harlan's Crossing. She just needed to give them something to hold. She walked to town. The main street of Harlan's Crossing was already moving by the time she arrived, wagons pulling goods between buildings, the blacksmith's hammer ringing in its familiar iron rhythm, women in heavy coats moving between the general store and the church and the collection of smaller businesses that constituted the commercial life of the valley. People saw her coming and registered her presence with the particular social calibration of a small town, a slight pause in conversation, a small readjustment of expression from ordinary to sympathetic, and then the resumption of ordinary life with the adjustments already made. She was a subject of sympathy. She had been since Edwin died. Since the foreclosure, she had become a subject of something closer to worried sympathy, the kind that carries an undercurrent of relief. Hard luck has a way of making the people who don't have it appreciate that fact more fully. She walked past all of it and pushed open the door of Aldous Coburn's general store. Coburn was behind his counter, a man in his mid-60s with a white mustache and the perpetual expression of a man doing arithmetic. He looked up when the door opened and registered a small involuntary shift, the same shift she had seen on every face in town since the foreclosure. The readjustment, the sympathy face. She set her crate on the floor, reached into the pocket of her coat, and placed Edwin's wedding ring on the counter between them. Coburn looked at the ring. He looked at her. He looked at the ring again. "Mrs. Howell," he said carefully, "I need a small cast-iron stove," she said, "the smallest you have. 20 feet of stovepipe jointed, a good shovel, a pickaxe." Coburn did not move immediately. He was looking at the ring with an expression she recognized, the expression of a man doing a moral calculation and not entirely comfortable with the result. "Ma'am," he said slowly, "whatever you're planning to do with a stove and that much pipe, if you're thinking of putting it in that old spring cellar up on the North Ridge, a stove won't do you much good in a hole in the ground. You'll smoke yourself out in 10 minutes. There's no way for the air to move. You understand what I'm saying? The smoke will go where I tell it," she said. Coburn looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man who has just heard a statement that is either very foolish or very interesting and cannot immediately determine which. Then he picked up the ring and began adding up the cost of what she'd asked for. Stellan was at the far end of the store examining a selection of iron bolts when Marin Howell's voice reached him. He had not noticed her come in. He had been focused on the bolt threads, comparing gauges, the habitual attention of a craftsman who does not know how to look at a hardware selection without immediately categorizing it. But he heard what she said to Coburn. He heard the list: stove, pipe, shovel, pickaxe. He heard Coburn's warning, and he heard her answer. "The smoke will go where I tell it." He did not turn around. He waited until he heard the door close behind her. Then he turned and looked at Coburn across the store. "What in God's name is she planning?" he asked. Coburn placed the ring carefully in his cash box. "I have no idea," he said, "but she paid for it." Stellan rode home thinking about the ring. A man's wedding ring surrendered for a stovepipe and a pickaxe. He had seen desperation before in various forms. The territory produced desperation the way it produced winter, reliably and in quantity. But what he had heard in Marin Howell's voice had not sounded like desperation. It had sounded like something more unsettling. It had sounded like a plan. He put it out of his mind. He had a door frame to finish for the Olin family on the south side of town, and November was moving fast, and there was no percentage in spending his time thinking about the decisions of a widow he barely knew. She would freeze, or she would come to her senses and accept the church's offer of temporary shelter, or some other arrangement would be made. The territory had a way of making arrangements for people who could not make them for themselves. Not always kind arrangements, but arrangements nonetheless. He finished the Oholen doorframe in 2 days. On the third day walking back from the lumber supply with a load of dowel rods, he went by the Northern Ridge Road, more or less by chance or so he told himself, and saw something that stopped him where he stood. There was a long trench on the hillside, 30 feet if it was an inch running from the mouth of the old spring cellar and angling away from it through the earth at a very slight downward grade. The trench was lined with flat field stone, carefully selected, carefully placed, fitted together with the kind of attention to surface contact that you only achieved when you understood what you were actually trying to do. Beside the trench where the stone ended, there was a neat pile of creek stone and a bucket of packed clay. And at the far end of the trench, she had begun the foundation for a small vertical pipe stack. Stellan stood in the road and looked at this for a long time. Then he left his dowel rods at the side of the road, climbed the embankment, and found her on her knees at the midpoint of the trench, fitting a flat capstone over the channel, packing the edges with clay against the cold and the damp. She looked up when she heard him coming, but did not stop working. "Mrs. Howell," he said. "Mr. Voss," she said, and went back to her capstone. He looked at the trench. He looked at the stone-lined channel running beneath the caps she had already placed. He looked at the small pipe stack beginning to take shape at the far end. He had been building structures for 30 years. He understood at the level of bone and muscle how air and heat moved through the built environment, and what he was looking at was by every principle he had spent 30 years mastering wrong. "This is a flue," he said. "Yes," she said. "A flue goes up," he said. "That is not a suggestion. That is the mechanism. Hot air rises because it is less dense than cold air. That pressure difference is what creates the draw, what pulls the smoke up and out of the house. Without that vertical movement, you have no draw. Without draw, the smoke backs up into the room. It will suffocate you within an hour of lighting a fire." She did not respond immediately. She set the capstone she'd been working with and pressed the clay flat along both edges, with her thumb smoothing it carefully, sealing it against the cold. Then she sat back on her heels and looked up at him. "Come here," she said. It was not a request exactly. It was not rude. It was simply the voice of a woman who had something to show him and did not want to waste time with preliminaries. He moved closer slightly against his better judgment, with the feeling of a man who is about to be shown something he cannot immediately dismiss. She took his hand. It was such an unexpected action that he froze entirely, and in that frozen moment she guided his palm to the top of a large flat stone that she had placed the previous afternoon at the far end of the completed section of trench. The stone had spent a full day absorbing the thin November sunlight, weak sunlight, winter sunlight, but sunlight nonetheless. Under his palm, the stone would warm. Not warm the way a stone beside a fire was warm. Not the aggressive radiating heat of something actively being heated, but warm in the way that a living thing was warm, the warmth of stored energy, the warmth of something that had received heat and held it slowly deeply in the way that mass holds things. "Feel that," Marin said. She did not look at his face. She was looking at the stone. It absorbed the sun this afternoon. It will still be giving that heat back at midnight. The rock does not forget what it receives, Mr. Voss. It holds it. She released his hand. "I am not building a place where smoke rises. I am building a place where smoke must travel before it is allowed to escape." 30 feet of stone-lined passage. The smoke enters hot, 400 degrees or more. By the time it reaches the stack at the far end, the stone has taken most of that heat. The stone gives it to the earth. The earth holds it. The walls of that cellar become a radiator, a gentle, constant, even radiator that requires almost no fuel to maintain because the earth itself is doing the work of holding what the fire put in. She picked up her capstone and began fitting it into place again. The vertical stack at the end still provides the draw, she said, as though completing a thought she had started some time ago, as though she had been waiting for the opportunity to explain it to someone, and now that the opportunity had arrived, she was going to use it efficiently. The smoke cools as it travels through the flue. It is still warmer than the outside air when it reaches the stack. Warmer air rises. The stack creates the low-pressure zone that pulls everything through. It is a weaker draw than a conventional chimney, yes, but sufficient, more than sufficient for a small, well-damped stove. Stellan stood in the cold and looked at the trench and felt the warmth of the stone fading slowly from his palm. He could not in that moment immediately identify the flaw. The physics were not wrong. He could feel that they were not wrong, not in the specific way he had expected them to be wrong. Hot air still rose. The stack at the end would still create a draw. The smoke would still move. The heat exchange was real. He was holding the evidence of it in the warmth still fading from his hand. The thermal mass of the Earth was real. Any miner knew the Earth held a constant temperature at depth, insulated from the surface by the sheer volume of its own mass. But it couldn't work. It was too simple. If it worked, someone would have built it before. If it worked, every homesteader in Dakota Territory would know about it. It won't draw, he said, because he needed to say something, and that was the closest thing to a specific objection he could assemble. Not enough. Not for a real fire, not for a Dakota winter. Perhaps not for a real fire, she said, but perhaps I do not need a real fire. Perhaps I need a small, slow fire that heats stone rather than air. She did not look up from her work. You are welcome to come back in January, Mr. Voss, and tell me I was wrong. He stood there for another moment, the warm stone cooling under the memory of his hand, the wind in the pines speaking its old language of imminence and cold. Then he picked up his dowel rods from the road below and walked back to town. The story reached the rest of Harlan's Crossing before he did. He had not intended to tell anyone. But Aldous Coburn had seen him climbing the embankment on the Ridge Road, and Coburn was a man who stored information the way he stored inventory, carefully organized and available for distribution at the appropriate moment. By evening, the broad facts were established. The Welsh widow was digging some kind of underground tunnel on the North Ridge. She was planning to put a stove in the old spring cellar. She believed she could heat an underground room with a fire that vented sideways through 30 feet of stone-lined earth. The reaction was what Stellan would have predicted, and what a part of him, the part that was still standing in the road feeling the warmth fading from a flat piece of Dakota stone, was not entirely comfortable with. They called it Howell's Folly. Some of the less charitable souls in town, men, who found the failures of others confirming rather than troubling, called it the Welsh Coffin. The name passed through the saloon, in the blacksmith, in the church social, with the easy efficiency of a story that confirms something people already believe, that grief makes people irrational, that women alone in winter are a problem, that will eventually resolve itself one way or another, that the territory has its own requirements, and those requirements do not bend for stubbornness or for sorrow. Stellan did not use either name, but he did not correct the people who used them in his presence. He had work to do. The Olin family needed their door frame hung before the cold got serious. The Jensen house needed its porch boards fixed before frost got under them. He had 2 cords of wood to split and stack his own stove, to bank for the long nights his own children to feed, and his own walls to maintain, against a winter that the old-timers were already saying would be a hard one. He had what he had built. He had Nora and Birch and Little Fern, and a house that could take what the winter gave and return it as warmth. He had 30 years of accumulated expertise in the structures that kept people alive in a country that actively tried to kill them. He had enough. A week passed. 2 weeks. November deepened into its final days, and the snow that had been tentative in the first week became committed real snow, now settling into the low places and staying there, the ground accepting the cold signature and not giving it back. At night, the temperature dropped below zero, and the pines on the ridge took on their winter weight, the branches pressing down under the accumulated white. Stellan's firewood pile was solid. His house was tight. He had checked every window frame, every door seal, every point where the outside might find its way in. He had banked his stone fireplace for the cold nights with the skill of a man who had done it for a decade in this same house, who knew exactly how much wood to put in, how far to close the damper, how to balance the fire's consumption against the house's needs. He knew his house. He was good at what he did. He did not go back to the North Ridge. but on one of the last days of November, coming back from the lumberyard with Birch walking beside him, the boy at that age where he matched his father's stride with a concentration that was both touching and faintly comic, Stellan glanced up toward the ridgeline and noticed something. There was no smoke rising from the old cellar site. He had expected, if the widow was still up there, if she had not come to her senses and come back to town, he had expected to see some evidence of fire. A smudge of gray rising from somewhere in the pines. The thin column of a struggling chimney. Something. The absence of smoke meant either that there was no fire or that the fire had gone out, or that something else entirely was happening up there that he did not understand. He told himself he didn't have time to think about it. Birch, walking beside him, looked up at his father's face, that particular sideways look that children use to read the temperature of adult silence, and said nothing. The boy was already learning at 8 years old that some of his father's silences were not invitations. They walked home in the early dark, the cold around them deepening with the evening, the stars in the black overhead burning with the particular hard clarity of a sky from which all warmth has been completely withdrawn. And in a hole in the ground on the north ridge of Harlan's Crossing, in a room of earth and fieldstone that held the long memory of 10,000 summers, in its walls a small fire burned very slowly in a little pot-bellied stove. The smoke went where it was told. It traveled down into the horizontal passage along 30 feet of stone, losing its heat degree by degree, warming the rock that warmed the earth that pressed gently inward from all sides. It climbed the final vertical stack and emerged at the surface as a thin, cool wisp, almost invisible in the cold air. So thin, so cool, so completely stripped of the energy it had entered with that a man standing 20 feet away would not have noticed it. The walls of the cellar, which should have been dead with cold and damp, were instead giving something back. Something slow and patient and steady. Not the aggressive, consuming heat of Stellan Voss's great stone fireplace. Something different. Something that felt, when you pressed your palm against it, less like heat and more like the memory of warmth. In the cellar, at her small table with a single candle for light and a wool blanket across her shoulders, Maren Howell opened Edwin's journal to the page with the underlined phrase, the page she had already read a dozen times and would read a dozen times more before the winter was done. The smoke must pay rent. She had built the thing he had sketched and never built. She had taken the idea from the journal of a dead man and put it into the ground with her own hands and her own back and her own days of labor in the cold. The earth around her was warm, not hot, not aggressively warm, but warm the way a living thing is warm, with a steady patience that a burning log could never match. She reached up and touched the wall beside her with her open hand. She could feel it, the faintest, most patient radiation of stored heat, the earth giving back what she had given it. The transaction Edwin had imagined. The rent being paid. Outside, the temperature fell to 10 below zero and kept going. The wind found the gaps in the pine canopy and sang through them, looking for something to take. It did not find her. She was inside the battery. She was warm. December arrived in Harlan's Crossing the way a creditor arrives, without announcement, without apology, and with the full authority of someone who knows the debt is real. The snow that had been tentative in November became in December a statement of permanent intention. It settled into the valley and the ridge lines and the spaces between buildings with the casual authority of something that has no reason to hurry because it has no reason to leave. The temperature dropped and stayed dropped, hovering in the single digits during the days and falling well below zero at night, when the sky cleared to that terrible, beautiful black that only appears when every molecule of warmth has been evacuated from the atmosphere, and what remains is pure, airless cold, and the hard light of stars that offer illumination without comfort. Harlan's Crossing contracted. The social life of the town, such as it was, pulled inward towards the heat sources. People moved between buildings quickly, heads down, the exposed skin of their faces turning red and then white at the edges if they stayed out too long. Children who had been running the main street in October were now kept inside, pressed against the windows, watching the world outside with the particular restless frustration of young animals denied their range. The days were short, the nights were very long. The darkness came early and settled in with the confidence of a tenant who has paid ahead. In the homes of Harlan's Crossing, the fireplaces and wood stoves worked without rest. Stellan Voss's great stone fireplace was the finest in town, and in December it earned that distinction every hour of every day. He had built it 8 years ago when he built the house 4 feet wide at the mouth, deep set, to capture the radiant heat of the back wall, the throat cut with a precision that produced a clean, powerful draw, regardless of wind direction. He was proud of that draw. On bitter nights, he could open the damper all the way and feel the air in the room pull toward the fire, the whole house becoming a single breath drawn inward, the fire eating and eating, and the warmth spreading out from the hearth in waves that you could feel even at the far wall, if the room was small enough and the fire was big enough. He burned a cord of wood in the first 3 weeks of December. Nora noted this with the quiet precision that was her particular gift. She did not say anything directly that was not her way. Instead, she arranged the household accounts on the kitchen table one evening after supper and left them there in a way that was clearly not accidental, the way a careful person leaves things that require attention in places where they will be noticed by the person who needs to notice them. Stellan looked at the accounts. He looked at the current woodpile. He looked at the projected length of winter. February was still 2 months away, and February in Dakota Territory was a different animal entirely from December. He ordered 2 more cords from the Halverson mill. This was the answer he knew. More wood, a bigger fire. The fire was the solution. The fire was always the solution. You fed it more, you pushed more heat into the room, you overwhelmed the cold with sheer thermal force. This was the logic of the frontier. Hearth, the cold is the enemy, the fire is the weapon, and the solution to insufficient warmth is always more fire. His father had known this. His grandfather before that. You did not negotiate with winter, you burned more wood. He split and stacked the new cords himself, working in the barn, on the coldest days, the wood ringing like stone against the maul, his breath a continuous cloud in the dim winter light. There was satisfaction in the work. There was satisfaction in the pile growing in the sacked rows of split pine that represented warmth converted into potential heat, waiting in solid form for the moment the stove would unlock it. This was something he could do, something he understood. Birch had a cough through most of December, not serious. Nothing that alarmed Nora or the town's doctor, but persistent, the deep rattling cough of a child whose chest is struggling against the cold air that came in when doors were opened and opened again all day long. Fern was better tougher than her brother in the way that younger children sometimes are adapted to the cold in ways that seemed almost defiant. But she slept badly, waking in the night with the covers piled over her head and still complaining of cold feet. Stellan moved their beds closer to the hearth wall. He checked the window frames again and found one on the north side that had developed a gap. Frost had gotten under the exterior board and lifted it just enough for the wind to find it. He chinked it with a mix of clay and pine pitch, pressing it in with his fingers, testing the seal with the back of his hand in the dark. Better. Not perfect, but better. He told himself this was what maintenance looked like. Every house required attention. No structure was static, wood moved with moisture, and cold joints opened and closed like slow breathing, and a good builder understood this and responded to it rather than imagining that his work was ever truly finished. He was not losing ground, he was maintaining ground. There was no difference. He believed this the way a man believes something because the alternative is too large to look at directly. Christmas came and went quietly. Nora made a good meal from what they had. The children got small things, a carved horse Stellan had made for Birch in the evenings, a cloth doll Nora had sewn for Fern. There was no church service because the pastor had taken ill in the second week of December and had not fully recovered. The town had sent food and medicine to his door and prayed for him from their own hearths, which was perhaps the most pragmatic form of worship the season permitted. It was on the last night of December, the last night of 1887, the temperature sitting at 17 below zero with a wind that was driving that cold against the walls of every structure in the valley that Stellan woke at 2 in the morning to the sound of his fire dying. He had banked it carefully before bed. He knew how to bank a fire. It was among the most basic competencies in his possession, the skill of loading and damping a firebox so that it held through the night, so that the coals were still alive in the morning and the room had not gone fully cold. He had done it 1,000 times. He did it without thinking the way he did most things that were deeply practiced. But the fire had gone further down than it should have. The room was cold in a way that reached him even in the bed under the blankets with Nora warm beside him. He could feel it in his nose and in the back of his throat, that particular quality of air, in a room where the temperature has dropped below the point where the human body can simply radiate it away. He got up. He rebuilt the fire, adding wood, coaxing the coals back to life, with the bellows working with the quiet efficiency of a man performing a familiar task in the dark. The fire came back. It always came back if the coals were still alive, if you worked it right. Within 20 minutes, the hearth was roaring again, the firelight pushing the shadows back to the corners of the room, the first waves of heat beginning to move outward from the stone. He stood at the hearth with his back to the fire, letting it warm him, and looked at his house. Birch was coughing softly in the children's room. Fern had kicked her blankets off again, a fact he discovered when he went in to check on them, and replaced the blankets with the careful, practiced quiet of a father who has learned not to wake sleeping children. The air in their room was cold enough that he could see his breath in the light of the candle he carried. He went back to the main room. He stood in front of the great roaring fire, the best fire in Harlan's Crossing, and he looked at the table by the north window. On the table was a cup of water that Birch had left there after supper. Stellan had not noticed it when he'd banked the fire. He noticed it now. It had frozen solid. He stood very still and looked at it. A cup of water 8 feet from the largest, finest stone fireplace in the valley, frozen so completely that when he picked it up, the water held the shape of the cup, without the cup, a perfect cylinder of pale ice. He set it back down carefully, as though it were fragile, as though it might break. He looked from the cup to the fire to the cup again. The fire was enormous. The fire was as large as a fire could reasonably be in a residential structure. The heat coming off the back wall of that hearth was intense enough to force you to step back from it. The draw was perfect. The damper was wide open. The air moving strongly through the room toward the fire, that powerful breath he was so proud of. The air moving through the room toward the fire. Cold air, moving through the room toward the fire. It moved through the room because the fire consumed it. The fire needed air. It needed a constant, enormous supply of oxygen to sustain combustion at the rate he was running it, and that air had to come from somewhere. It came in around the window frames. It came in under the door. It came in through the 100 small imperfections of a wooden structure that he had sealed and resealed and would seal again and could never completely seal because wood was wood and cold was cold, and no joint in the physical world was ever truly perfect. The fire was pulling the cold in. It was pulling it in through every gap and seam in the house, an endless supply of fresh, frigid air to feed its consumption. And that cold air was moving along the floor and the walls before it reached the fire, before it was finally consumed and transformed. It was cooling the room at the same rate the fire was heating it. The massive fireplace, the finest in the valley, the thing he had built with such pride and such precision, it was not just heating the house. It was heating the Dakota winter. It was burning fuel to push heat up the chimney and out into the sky, and simultaneously pulling the cold in through the walls to replace the air it consumed, and the net result, the actual physical result that he was holding in his hands in the form of a cylinder of frozen water, was that 8 feet from a roaring fire in a house he had built himself, the temperature was below 32 degrees. Stellan Voss sat down on the floor in front of his great stone fireplace. He was not a man who sat on floors. He was not a man who did things like that. He sat in chairs at tables in the specific locations that a man of his age and position occupied in his own home. But the floor was where his legs took him slowly, as though the weight of the realization was a physical thing. And so he sat on the floor with his back against the base of the hearth, the fire roaring above and behind him, and he looked at the frozen cup of water on the table. He sat there for a long time. He thought about Marin Howell. He thought about the stone she had placed under his hand on the hillside warm in the November cold. He thought about the 30-foot trench lined with flat field stone, the capstone sealed with clay, the small vertical stack at the far end. He thought about what she had said, "I am building a place where smoke must travel before it is allowed to escape." He thought about the flue drawing the heat into the stone transferring it to the earth holding it and giving it back slowly, patiently, the way the earth held everything without rushing, without waste across a time scale that made human impatience look like a child's tantrum. He thought about what he had said to her. A flue goes up. That is not a suggestion. That is the mechanism. He looked at the frozen cup. He got up, rebuilt the fire properly, and went back to bed. He lay in the dark for a long time with his eyes open, listening to Nora's steady breathing beside him, listening to the wind against the walls of the house he had built, and thinking about what it meant for a man to be wrong about something he was certain of. He did not come to a comfortable conclusion. He did not come to any conclusion at all. He put the question in a box and set the box aside the way a man does with things he cannot deal with in the middle of a January night, with a sick child and a shrinking woodpile and 2 more months of winter ahead. He was a practical man. Practical men handled the problem in front of them and put the larger questions away for later. He slept eventually badly. The 12th of January, 1888 began as a lie. Stellan noticed it when he stepped outside just after dawn to check the woodpile. The air had a quality he had not felt since October, a yielding softness that had no business being present in January. The temperature was above freezing. Above freezing, he stood in his yard with his coat half buttoned and felt the air on his face and could not entirely trust it. In 12 years of Dakota winters, he had learned not to trust warmth in January. Warmth in January was not generosity. It was misdirection. But the children wanted to go out, and Nora thought some fresh air would be good for Birch's cough, and the temperature was undeniably mild, 40 degrees by mid-morning, the snow on the south-facing rooftops beginning to drip, and Stellan was at the Halverson place putting in a window repair, and could not very well come home to supervise what was, by all surface appearances, an ordinary midwinter morning. Birch was 8 years old. He knew the way home from school. He had walked it 100 times. It was at 2 o'clock in the afternoon that the sky changed. Stellan was packing his tools when he heard it, or rather felt it first. A pressure change so rapid and total that his ears registered it before his arm registered the wall of gray-white that had appeared at the northern horizon with the sudden absolute finality of a curtain being dropped on a stage. The temperature fell so fast that the drops of meltwater on the south rooftops froze before they reached the ground. The wind hit the town from the northwest like something solid, a physical force that drove the snow horizontal, and the snow was not the heavy, wet flakes of a normal storm, but something finer, something that was almost more powder than snow, that found every gap, every eye, every exposed inch of skin, and hit it with the precision of 1,000 small needles. The world disappeared. In less than 4 minutes, Sutherland could not see the building next to him. He could not see the road. He could not see anything beyond the reach of his own arm. He pushed his tools under the eave of the Halverson porch and ran in the direction he believed was home. That was all he had, the direction he believed, with no visual confirmation, no landmark, nothing but the map in his head and the ground under his boots. He found his house by running into the wall of it. He came through the door, and Nora was there already at the window. Already with that look. Not panic, Nora did not panic. That was not what she was, but a focused, bright attention that was worse than panic, because it meant the situation was real. She had the same look she'd had when Fern had fallen from the fence post 2 summers ago and opened her forehead on the rock below. "Birch," Stellan said. "Then. He hasn't come home," she said. He turned around and went back into the storm. What followed was 20 minutes that Stellan would not, in the years that followed, ever describe in detail to anyone, including Nora. He found the boy 2 houses from their own, crouched against the base of a fence post, with his arms around his knees and his face pressed into his own coat, doing instinctively the one right thing, staying still, staying low, staying out of the wind's direct force. Stellan gathered him up and carried him the remaining 50 yards to the door, with his own coat wrapped around the boy's head, navigating entirely by the feel of the ground under his boots in the direction of the wind against his back. Inside, Nora had the fire as large as she could make it. Stellan held Birch close to the hearth and felt the boy shaking against him, deep, full-body shaking, the kind that comes from cold, getting into the core, and he held him and waited for it to pass and felt the heat of the fire on his own face and back while he held the boy. It took a long time for Birch to stop shaking. The blizzard did not stop at all. That night, the temperature fell to 20 below. By the next morning, it was 30 below and the wind had not eased. The world outside the windows of Stellan's house had ceased to exist as a visual reality. There was nothing but white and gray, the 2 colors of absolute winter, and the sound of the wind, which had ceased to sound like wind and had become something else, some continuous mechanical roar that was simply the background noise of a world that had decided to be hostile. Birch had a fever by evening, not high 101, but present the body's announcement that it was fighting something, that the cold had gotten in beyond the skin and the core was responding. Nora sat with him, her hand on his forehead, and at regular intervals, her face arranging itself into the particular careful expression that mothers use to conceal their worry from sick children without concealing it from themselves. Stellan kept the fire large. He kept it as large as the fireplace could manage, feeding it at intervals through the night, sleeping in the chair beside the hearth so he could tend it without delay. The house was warm near the fire. Away from it, it was not. He had added blankets to all the beds, had stuffed rags into the window gap he had found before, and into two others he found now, had done everything he knew how to do, every technique in his considerable repertoire. The second day of the blizzard, he burned through the equivalent of what should have been a week's worth of wood. On the evening of the second day, Nora came to him quietly while the children were asleep and told him without drama that the woodpile was approaching the point where decisions would need to be made. She did not say what decisions. She did not need to. He went out in the diminished wind of late evening. The storm had pulled back slightly, not gone, but resting like a man catching his breath before the next effort, and looked at the pile. She was right, as she almost always was about things that required accurate counting. He went back inside. He stood at his great stone fireplace and looked at it with new eyes. He had built this house. He had built this fireplace. He had used the best materials and the best techniques of his craft and 30 years of accumulated expertise, and he was running out of wood in the second day of a blizzard, and his son had a fever, and the cup of water on the far side of the room had once again a skin of ice on its surface. He thought about Marin Howell. He thought about the things she had said to him on the hillside. "You are welcome to come back in January, Mr. Voss, and tell me I was wrong." He thought about the way she had guided his hand to the warm stone without asking permission, with the directness of a person who has no time for the social protocols that make things complicated. He thought about the 2 weeks of silence from the North Ridge, no smoke, no visible fire, no sign of life, and he thought about the fact that he had not once in those 2 weeks considered that the absence of visible smoke might be the point. He thought about what it would mean to walk up that ridge and find her frozen. And he thought about what it would mean to walk up that ridge and find her not frozen. He did not sleep that night. He sat beside the fire and fed it through the hours, listening to Birch's breathing in the next room, listening to the wind decrease, and then increase again, and then decrease, and he assembled in his mind the architecture of a decision. Not the emotional structure of it. He was not equipped for that kind of construction, but the practical structure. The sequence of events, the order of operations. He was a builder. He thought in sequences. On the third morning, the wind dropped to something a man could walk into, not easily, not comfortably, but physically possible. The wind was no longer a wall, but merely an obstacle, something that pushed rather than stopped. The temperature was still 35 below zero. The snow was deep, chest deep in the drifts that had built against the north sides of everything, shallower in the open ground, knee deep on average. He dressed with the thoroughness of a man preparing for something he cannot undo. Every layer he owned, his heaviest coat, his face wrapped in 2 scarves with only his eyes left exposed, his heaviest gloves over wool liners, his boots with the felt insoles he had made last fall. Nora was awake. She had been awake, he suspected, most of the night. She stood in the kitchen doorway and watched him dress. "Where?" she said. Just that, not a full question. She knew him well enough to know that if he was dressing this way with this kind of systematic attention, he was going somewhere specific. He looked at her. He thought about how to answer. He had spent 30 years being certain about things, and certainty had a specific gravity. It pressed down, it settled, it made a man confident in the specific way that a well-built foundation makes a man confident. You do not think about it because there is no reason to think about it because it is solid. What he was feeling now was not that. "To fix my mistake," he said. He went out before she could respond. He did not look back at the house. He did not look back at the woodpile. He looked north toward the ridge, toward the place where the hawthorn and wild raspberry canes grew thick against the hillside, and he began to move through the snow. The drifts were brutal. In the open ground between the last house of town and the base of the ridge, the wind had sculpted the snow into ridges and valleys that bore no relationship to the actual ground beneath, and he crashed through them, sometimes finding solid footing, sometimes breaking through into a pocket where the snow was thigh-deep and soft, and he had to drag himself forward with his arms. He was breathing hard within the first 100 yards. The cold of that air in his lungs was a specific, familiar pain, the pain of a body processing something it was not designed to process, converting oxygen from a substance that hurt. He had not made a decision to bring a shovel. He had brought one automatically from the same trained instinct that made him check window frames and test door hinges. If you go somewhere in winter, you bring a shovel, because in winter, a shovel is what stands between a man and the landscape. It took him nearly an hour to reach the North Ridge. He climbed through the deep snow of the lower slope on hands and knees in places the shovel jammed into the slope above him and used as an anchor hauling himself up the way a much younger man would have found merely difficult and he found genuinely dangerous. His hands were numb despite the gloves. His face, where the scarf had shifted, felt like it belonged to someone else. He found the hawthorn by walking into it. The branches buried under snow had formed a low solid mass that he struck his shin against hard enough to stagger him. He followed the line of it with his gloved hand until he found where it opened around the cellar entrance. Then he began to dig. The drift over the entrance was 4 feet deep. He shoveled for 10 minutes that felt like an hour, working with the controlled urgency of a man who cannot afford to stop, but also cannot afford to exhaust himself the specific pace of emergency labor. The snow was dense, packed by the wind into something close to the consistency of wet sand. Each shovelful was heavy. He uncovered the top of the wooden door. He stopped. He stood with the shovel in his hands and the door exposed before him, and the sound of his own breathing loud in the relative windbreak of the cleared space, and he tried to prepare himself for what he was about to find. She had been up here alone for 6 weeks. The temperature had been 35 below for 2 days. There had been no visible smoke from the site in all that time, which might mean the system worked the way she had said it would, or might mean the fire had gone out days ago, and she had simply, he grabbed the iron handle and pulled. The door came open without resistance. Not frozen, not even stiff. It swung freely on its hinges as though it had been used recently, as though the cold had simply decided not to claim it. And from the darkness below, through the rectangular opening, he had uncovered in the snow, a wave of air rose and met his face. Warm air. Dry, warm, clean air. Not the aggressive, scorching warmth of a fire at close range. Something gentler than that. Something steadier. The warmth of a room that has been warm for a long time, that has soaked up enough heat over enough weeks that the air itself carries it without effort. The way a stone wall in summer holds the memory of 1,000 days of sunlight. It was warmer than his house. Standing at 35 degrees below zero, with the Dakota winter arranged in every direction as far as the eye could reach and considerably further, Stellenbosch stood at the mouth of a hole in the ground and felt warmer air rising to meet him than he had felt inside his own walls in the last 2 days. He could not immediately process this. His mind, which was a good mind, analytical, experienced, precise in the way that long practice makes a mind precise, ran the information against everything it contained and found no framework for it. It did not fit. It did not belong in the world he understood. It was not possible that a cellar heated by a handful of sticks through a sideways pipe was warmer than a room with a stone fireplace the size of a wagon bed. He went down the 3 short steps anyway. The cellar was dim, lit by a single candle and the faint residual glow of the little stove in the corner, the damper most of the way, closed barely a coal's worth of heat being generated at any given moment. The walls were earth and stone. The floor was packed dirt. Everything that should have been cold was not cold. He reached out and pressed his palm flat against the earthen wall beside the stairs. It was warm, not dramatically warm, not the burning heat of a fire-heated surface, but warm the way a living thing was warm. Warm the way skin was warm. Warm with a steadiness that had nothing urgent or consuming about it, the warmth of something that had been patient for weeks, that had taken what was given, and held it without losing it, that was still giving back what it had been given, when the fire was large and the stone was being charged. Maren Howell was sitting at her small table mending a length of wool cloth with the focus of a woman who has found that needlework is among the better uses of time in confined spaces. The candle beside her was steady, no draft reached it. She was not wearing her heavy coat. She was not wearing her heavy coat in a room surrounded by 6 inches of earthen wall and 35-degree air and 2 feet of Dakota snow, and she was not wearing it because she did not need it. She looked up at him. She did not appear surprised. She appeared, if anything, as though she had been waiting for exactly this. Not impatiently, not with triumph, but with the particular composure of someone who has been correct about something important for long enough that the confirmation has ceased to feel like victory and has become simply the next fact. Stellan stood at the base of the stairs and looked at the walls and looked at the stove and looked at the pipe that descended into the floor toward the horizontal flue below, and he felt something give way inside him that he could not name precisely, something structural, something load-bearing. He looked from the walls to the tiny stove barely warm to the eye, to the pipe dropping down. He traced the path with his mind, the heat moving through the stone passage being taken from the smoke degree by degree given to the earth held. The earth giving it back slowly, evenly, everywhere at once, through every surface of the room simultaneously. No drafts, no cold corners, no frozen cups of water on tables 8 feet from a roaring fire. Just this, an even patient total warmth that asked almost nothing to maintain and gave back everything it was given. He thought about what he had built in his house. He thought about what he had been building his whole life. He thought about the window frames he had sealed and resealed, the cords of wood he had burned, the fire that ate and ate and sent most of what it consumed up through the chimney and out into the sky, a vast ongoing gift to the Dakota winter at the peak of his own family's warmth and his own winter wood supply. He thought about Birch's fever. One word came out, just one, a cloud of frozen breath in the warm air of the cellar, barely louder than a whisper. How? It was not when it left him a fully formed question. It was not asking for a technical explanation, though, that would come. It was the sound a man makes when the ground shifts under his feet, not a request for information, but an involuntary vocalization of the moment when the world stops being the thing he understood it to be and becomes something larger and more complicated, and in the end more true. Maren set down her mending. She looked at him, at the ice in his beard, at the snow packed into every fold of his coat, at the hollow, storm-scoured look of a man who has been out in 35 below for the better part of an hour, and her expression did not hold triumph. It held something quieter than that, something that might have been in a woman who had spent 6 weeks alone in a hole in the ground, surviving on her dead husband's ideas and her own labor, the closest available thing to mercy. She stood up. "Your family is cold, Mr. Voss," she said. It was a statement, not a question, not a reproach. Just a fact plainly spoken, the way she seemed to speak on all facts as things that were true, regardless of how inconvenient they were, things that required acknowledgement before anything else could happen. "Bring them here," she said. "There is wood enough." He went back into the storm. There was no deliberation about it, no moment of standing in the warmth of the cellar and weighing the comfort of staying against the necessity of going. Maren had said, "Bring them here," and Stellan Voss turned around and climbed back up the 3 short steps and went back out into 35 below zero with the same automatic purposefulness of a man who has been given a task that his hands already understand before his mind has fully processed it. The cold hit him like a door. After the cellar's gentle warmth, it was not merely cold, it was a physical rebuke, the world reasserting its authority with complete indifference to what he had just experienced below ground. He pulled his scarves up over his nose and bent into what remained of the wind and began moving back toward town, following the trench he had broken through the drifts on the way up. His own path already beginning to soften at the edges as the blown snow filled it, but still visible, still navigable. He moved faster going down the ridge than he had coming up, not because it was easier, but because Birch's fever was a clock, and clocks do not negotiate. Nora met him at the door. She had dressed the children while he was gone, both of them in every layer they owned, their faces showing above the wool wrappings, with the wide-eyed attentiveness of children who understand that something serious is happening without understanding what it is. Fern had her cloth doll tucked under one arm. Birch, flushed with fever but standing, was trying to look like a person who was fine. He was not fine, but he was standing, and that was enough. Nora looked at Stellan's face when he came through the door, and she read it the way she always read him, quickly, completely, without asking for anything to be explained that his face had already said. She had been reading him for 23 years. She knew the difference between his uncertain face and his decided face, and what she saw now was neither. What she saw was something new, something that looked like a man who has had the ground shifted under him and has not yet finished finding his footing, but has identified the direction he needs to move and is moving in it. "We're going to the Howell cellar," he said. "Pack what you can carry." She did not ask if he was certain. She did not ask if it was safe or warm, or whether the widow had survived the blizzard, because the fact that he was proposing this told her all she needed to know about the answers to those questions. She packed blankets and the remaining food-dried meat, 2 apples, a half loaf of bread into a canvas bag, and she picked up Fern and told Birch to hold his father's hand, and they went out. The journey back to the ridge was the hardest thing Stellan Voss had done in years, and he had done genuinely hard things. Carrying Fern himself and breaking the trail ahead for Nora and Birch, pulling the boy through the deep sections, finding the path by memory and instinct. More than sight, it took 40 minutes for a walk that in summer took 10. The cold worked at them from every exposed angle. Birch stopped complaining about the cold after the first 5 minutes, which was actually more alarming than if he had kept complaining, and Stellan kept his hand on the boy's shoulder and kept him moving, kept talking to him in the low, steady voice of a man who needs another person to keep moving and has learned that the voice is the rope. They came down the 3 steps into the cellar, and the warmth closed over them like water over a stone. Fern made a sound, a small, involuntary sound, the sound of a body registering relief before the mind has had time to frame it as a concept. She pressed her face into Stellan's shoulder and went still, the rigid, braced posture of a cold child softening all at once. Nora stopped just inside the entrance and stood for a moment with her eyes closed, and Stellan watched her face change, watched the concentrated effort that cold forces on a face simply release the muscles around her eyes and jaw, letting go of something they had been holding for 2 days without her being consciously aware of it. Birch sat down on the earthen floor without being told. He sat with his back against the wall, the warm wall, the wall that had been absorbing heat for 6 weeks and giving it back a steady, even radiation. And after a few minutes, his shoulders came down from around his ears, and his breathing deepened, and the flush in his face, which had been the sharp red of wind cold layered over fever heat, began to settle towards something more ordinary. He did not speak. He leaned his head against the wall and closed his eyes with the absolute trust of a sick child who has been brought somewhere safe by his father. Maren had moved her single chair to the corner and was standing at the stove, adding a small piece of wood to the firebox, with the careful economy of someone who has been managing a resource successfully and sees no reason to change the approach, simply because there are now more people in the room. The fire was small. Stellan watched her feed it with the practiced minimalism of a person who has learned over 6 weeks of necessity exactly how little the system required, and was still learning that was less than she'd thought. Nora looked at the walls. She looked at the stove. She looked at Maren Howell, at the woman who had been in the social accounting of Harlan's Crossing, an object of pity and then of morbid speculation and then of dismissal. And she saw someone who was warm and dry and calm in the middle of the worst blizzard in 20 years. And her face did something that Stellan recognized as his wife, arriving at a conclusion that she would not need to revise. "Thank you," Nora said. "It was simple. It was total." "Sit," said Maren. "Rest." They stayed for 2 days. The blizzard made the decision for them, returning on the second night with renewed energy as though it had rested and was prepared to make a final point. It howled at the surface, scoured the drifts into new configurations, drove the temperature to 40 below in the small hours of the morning. Above the cellar, the world was a white screaming negation of everything habitable. Below, in the earth lung that Maren had built with a pickaxe and a dead man's vision, 5 people were warm. They talked eventually. Not immediately. The first hours were recovery, the body's demand to simply be warm without having to do anything with that warmth, to let it soak in and undo what the cold had done. But by evening of the first day, when the children were sleeping against the warm wall wrapped in blankets, Nora asked Maren the question that Stellan had not quite managed to ask, the full version of the single broken word he had produced at the top of the stairs. "How does it work?" Nora said. "Actually work. I want to understand it." Maren sat with Edwin's journal in her lap and explained it. She explained it the way she must have explained it to herself over the weeks of its construction, methodically in the order of principles rather than procedures, starting with what the earth was and what it did and why, and building from there to the specific mechanism of the flue and the thermal mass in the draft. She spoke without condescension and without false simplicity, at the pace of someone who believes the person she is talking to is capable of understanding what she is saying if she says it correctly. Nora listened with total attention. Stellan listened too. He sat on the floor again. This man who did not sit on floors, but the earth floor of the cellar was warmer than most chairs he'd occupied in the last 2 days, And he listened to Marin Howell explain the system his trade should have arrived at generations ago, and he let it in. Not fighting it, not running it against his expertise and measuring the discrepancy. Just letting it in the way the earth let heat in, accepting it and holding it and beginning to understand what it meant. She showed him the journal. She opened it to the pages of Edwin's drawings, the horizontal flues, the vertical stacks, the careful annotations in the compact script of a self-taught man who had understood that his observations were worth preserving precisely because no one else was preserving them. Stellan looked at the drawings for a long time. He turned the pages slowly. He studied the progression of the concept across the drawings, the way each sketch refined the previous one, the way an idea grows when an intelligent mind returns to it repeatedly over time. He thought about Edwin Howell, whom he had barely known, a quiet man, a miner, a man who had declined his offer of help with the house construction with a polite firmness that Stellan had privately found slightly irritating, as though the man didn't recognize good craftsmanship when it was offered. He thought about what it meant that this quiet, dying miner had spent his last good years thinking about heat and earth and the waste built into every fireplace and every home in the territory, and had arrived at something true and had written it down in a leather journal that his wife had carried off the property in a wooden crate when the bank took everything else. He thought about waste, the profound systematic waste he had built into every house in Harlan's Crossing, every chimney sending its heat as a gift to the open sky, every fireplace pulling cold air in to replace what it consumed, every family burning through their winter wood at a rate that left them vulnerable to exactly what had nearly happened to his own family in the last 2 days. He had built 16 houses in this valley, 16 houses, all of them wrong in the same fundamental way. Perfectly constructed, tightly jointed, carefully maintained, and wrong at the level of principle in a way that no amount of good joinery could fix. He had been building elegant containers for a broken system. He had been perfecting the vessel without examining what the vessel was designed to do. On the morning of the second day, when Birch woke without fever and ate a piece of dried meat with the appetite of a boy returning to himself, Stellan looked at the earthen walls of the cellar and made a decision. It was not a dramatic decision. It arrived without ceremony, without the internal fanfare that people sometimes describe accompanying major changes. It arrived the way the warmth of the cellar had arrived when he first descended the stairs, simply as a fact, something that was already true and needed only to be acknowledged. He was going to learn this, all of it, from the beginning. The blizzard broke on the morning of the third day. Not gradually, it simply stopped. The way certain kinds of violence stop all at once, leaving behind an absence so total that the silence seemed loud. The wind dropped to nothing. The sky cleared to a blue so deep and pure, it looked manufactured, the particular blue that only appears after great storms, when the atmosphere has spent everything it had and is temporarily utterly empty. The cold remained, it would remain for weeks yet, but it was no longer moving. It was the cold of stillness, the cold that a man can negotiate with if he has adequate clothing and a destination. They surfaced into the white world one at a time, Stellan first testing the depth of the snow and determining the best route down, then Birch, then Fern, who had recovered her animation entirely and immediately declared that the snow was deep enough to be satisfying, and finally Nora with Marin behind her. Harlan's Crossing had survived, barely and with costs that would not be fully tallied for weeks, but it had survived. 3 people had died in the surrounding territory, a rancher caught in the open, an elderly widow whose fire had gone out, and who had not been found for a day and a half, a boy of 12, whose story was in its broad outlines too similar to Birch's for Stellan to think about with comfort. Livestock losses were severe. Several structures had been damaged by the weight of accumulated snow. Almost everyone had burned through their winter wood far faster than anticipated and was now looking at February with genuine anxiety. The story of the Voss family, that Stellan Voss, the master builder of Harlan's Crossing, had taken his wife and sick children to shelter in the Welsh widow's underground cellar during the worst of the blizzard, and that they had emerged warm and intact, while houses he had built himself were barely habitable, spread through the town with the particular velocity of a story that overturned something people thought they understood. The first reaction was disbelief. This was predictable, and Stellan had expected it. The second reaction was the specific discomfort of people who had called something Howell's folly and were now being asked to revise that assessment. This was also predictable. The third reaction, the one that mattered, the one that arrived after the disbelief and the discomfort had run their course, was a quiet, practical curiosity. These were frontier people. They were not ideologues. They believed in what worked ultimately with the pragmatism of people who have seen what happens when things don't work. And what had worked irrefutably in the worst blizzard in 2 decades was a hole in the ground on the North Ridge that a Welsh widow had dug with a pickaxe and filled with a principle. Aldous Coburn was the first to come to her. He arrived at the cellar on a clear, cold day in the week after the blizzard, carrying a tin of coffee and a piece of Marin's own wedding ring's worth of dignity, and he sat on the step outside the entrance and asked her to explain what she had built and why it worked. He was a practical man who had sold her the tools and watched her go to work with them and privately expected to hear she had died before February. He was not a man who found it easy to sit with that kind of error, and the tin of coffee was his way of acknowledging it without requiring a formal accounting. She explained it to him the way she had explained it to Nora, fully patiently from principles. He went home and thought about it for 2 days. Then he came back with specific questions. Then he came back again with a neighbor, a man named Birger Holm, whose family had the most severe wood shortage in town and who was looking at the remaining weeks of winter with a kind of controlled desperation that the blizzard had burned away all pretense of hiding. Stellan came every day. He did not announce this as a formal arrangement. He simply appeared in the morning, sometimes with tools, sometimes with materials, sometimes with just himself and the notebook. He had begun keeping a new notebook purchased from Coburn because he had decided that if Edwin Howell's habit of recording observations was worth anything, and it clearly was worth more than everything Stellan had built in the last 11 years, then he would adopt it. He sat with Marin and went through the journal page by page. He asked questions that were the questions of a builder. How does the stone seal against ground moisture? What is the minimum flue length required to achieve adequate heat transfer? How do you calculate the draft strength at the stack for a given fire size? She answered from principle. He translated into practice. It was, he would think later, the most productive conversation of his professional life. And it had taken him 52 years and a blizzard and a frozen cup of water and an hour and 35 below zero to get there. On the first day of March, 1888, the snow still deep on the ground, but the light changed, that specific change that happens in early March when the angle of the sun shifts just enough that the body registers it before the thermometer does. They broke ground on the first new structure. The Holt family had lost their home in the blizzard, not to the cold directly, but to the sequence of events the cold had set in motion. The fire left unattended in the panic of a family trying to find their youngest child, the sparks on the dry wood wall, the structure too frozen and remote for any meaningful firefighting effort. They had survived. The house had not. They were living with relatives in conditions that were sustainable for a week and difficult for a month and impossible for Dakota Spring. Stellan organized the crew. 6 men, all of them capable builders in the conventional sense, all of them now in possession of a more complicated relationship with their own expertise than they had had before the blizzard. They were not humbled in the way that breaks men. They were humbled in the way that opens them. The kind of humbling that comes when a man is shown that the world is larger than his current map of it. They broke ground on a south-facing hillside at the edge of the Holt property, where the slope gave them the depth they needed without excessive excavation, and the aspect gave them the passive solar benefit that Marin had identified in Edwin's later journal pages. The understanding that south-facing windows, even in a subterranean structure, could contribute meaningfully to the thermal charging of the interior mass. The work was different from anything Stellan had built before, and the difference was instructive in ways he was still finding weeks later. Instead of fighting the site, instead of imposing a structure on the landscape, clearing and leveling and asserting the rectilinear logic of conventional construction against the natural contours of the earth, they were negotiating with it. The trench for the thermal flue followed the natural drainage line of the hillside because the drainage line was where the soil was most permeable and would most readily accept and distribute heat. The entry was positioned not where a conventional door would be most visible from the road, but where the prevailing wind would be least likely to compromise the draft in the stack. Every decision was a conversation with the site rather than an overruling of it. Marin walked the ground before they started. She walked it slowly, studying the slope and the drainage and the aspect making small notations in a journal of her own new given to her by Nora, who had understood without being told that a woman who built things from journals should have a journal to build in. She did not issue commands. She made observations. The observations had the authority of someone who had spent 6 weeks learning firsthand what worked and what did not, and the men on the crew heard that authority and responded to it without requiring it to be argued for. This Stellan notice was its own kind of skill, the ability to be right in a way that other people could receive. Edwin must have had it too in his quiet way. It was perhaps a Welsh thing. Perhaps it was simply a rare human thing, the capacity to hold knowledge without weaponizing it. The Holt structure took 3 weeks to complete. It was not large, a single main room, a small sleeping alcove, the thermal flue running 28 feet along the back slope, but when they lit the first fire in the small iron stove and felt the walls begin to charge, when they watched the temperature in the room hold steady at 58 degrees on a night when the outside temperature was 12 below, Silas Holt sat down at his family's new table and put his hands flat on the surface and breathed in the clean, warm, still air of a room that the earth was holding, and he did not say anything for a long time. His wife, standing at the small south-facing window that Marin had specified and Stellan had built with particular care, put her hand against the glass and felt the faint warmth of even a March sun that had traveled through the glass and into the room and into the wall behind the window and was already slowly being stored. "It feels like," she said and paused, searching for the word, "it feels like the house is alive." "It is," Marin said, "in a manner of speaking. It breathes." Word traveled, the environment. In a small valley in a hard territory in the spring of 1888, word about something that worked and always traveled, because things that worked were the difference between life and its absence. And people in such places had not yet developed the luxury of being skeptical about demonstrated results. By the time the snow was gone from the south-facing slopes and the first mud of spring had arrived, 3 more families had asked about building, using the Welsh method as it was already being called, without anyone having formally named it, the territory's way of attributing things to their origin. Stellan was asked repeatedly to explain the design. He explained it each time with the care of a man who is still learning something and knows it, who has not yet made the mistake of thinking he has learned enough to stop listening. When people asked who had invented it, he answered without hesitation. "A miner named Edwin Howell thought of it," he said. "His wife built it. I just held the hammer." He said this every time to everyone who asked for the rest of his life. He said it not as false modesty. Stellan Voss was not a modest man by nature, and the effort of accurate attribution was therefore genuine and therefore worth something, but as the specific, irreducible truth of what had happened. The idea had come from a dying Welsh miner who had spent his working life underground and had understood from that position of deep intimacy with the earth something that men who built on its surface had not seen. His wife had taken that understanding and tested it against the hardest winter the territory had seen in 2 decades and found it sound. What Stellan had contributed was the ability to formalize it, to scale it, to translate it from the specific instance of one woman's survival into a system that could be taught and built and refined. All 3 things had been necessary. None of the 3 was sufficient alone, Brown. He thought about this often in the years that followed. He thought about the way knowledge moves not in straight lines, not from expert to novice in the orderly transmission that professional pride would prefer, but sideways unexpectedly across the gap between a dying man's notebook and a widow's desperate need, across the gap between a woman who understood principle and a man who understood practice, across all the gaps that get bridged only when people stop insisting on the direction the knowledge is supposed to travel. The Welsh method, as it developed over the following decade, became more sophisticated. Marin worked with Stellan and eventually with the other builders in the valley, refining the principles that Edwin had sketched into an increasingly practical and adaptable system. South-facing windows became standard calibrated to the latitude for maximum winter gain. The thermal flue was integrated into the foundation systems of more conventional-looking surface structures so that the benefits of the Earth's thermal mass could be accessed without the full commitment to underground living that the original cellar required. Passive ventilation systems were added, drawing fresh air through underground channels that preconditioned it before it entered the living space, eliminating the drafts that were the constant complaint of conventional construction. The houses were warm in ways that the old houses had not been warm. Not aggressively warm, not the roasting front, freezing back warmth of a house built around a large fireplace, but evenly warm, quietly warm, warm in the way that the cellar had been warm, as though the warmth were coming from the structure itself, rather than from any particular point within it. They used a fraction of the wood. They held their temperature through the night without tending. In summer, they stayed cool without any effort at all. The thermal mass that had stored winter cold, releasing it slowly through the hottest months, making the brutal Dakota summers bearable in a way that no amount of cross-ventilation in a conventional wooden structure could match. Lives were saved, not all at once, not dramatically, not in any single moment that could be pointed to as the evidence, but in the aggregate across the hard winters that followed, in the families that made it through February without running out of wood, in the children who did not develop the chest sickness that cold and damp brought, in the old people who did not freeze when the fire went out in the night. The deaths that did not happen are always the invisible accounting of a good idea. The ledger entries that no one writes down because you cannot record the absence of something. Maren Howell lived her life in the cellar, and then in the expanded version of the cellar, and finally in her later years in a proper Welsh method structure that Stellan built for her with the craftsmanship of a man paying a debt he could not otherwise discharge. It was built into the south-facing slope of the North Ridge, close enough to the original cellar that she could walk there in a few minutes on clear days, which she occasionally did not, from nostalgia exactly, but from the habit of returning to the place where a thing was first true, the way you return to the sentence in a book where an idea first struck you to check whether it still strikes you the same way. It always did. She had no children of her own. She had something else instead, a town that had built itself differently because of what she had understood, a generation of builders who had learned a different way of thinking about heat and earth and the relationship between the built world and the natural one, a set of principles that spread from the Black Hills outward through the territory and beyond. It carried in the notebooks of men who had learned from her and in the journals of women who had read about her quietly without the ceremony that history usually reserves for the people it decides to remember. She did not seek that spread. She was content in her warm house on the North Ridge with her books and her journal and the small efficient stove that asked almost nothing and gave back everything that was asked of it. In her later years on winter evenings, she developed a habit. She would sit in the chair by the stove, not close to it, not needing to be close to it, because the walls around her were holding the heat of 10,000 small fires across as many hours, and she would open Edwin's journal to the last pages. Not the technical drawings, not the mining notes, not the careful records of rock strata and ventilation calculations. The last pages where the handwriting had changed, loosened slightly, unsteady, the hand of a man whose body was failing, but whose mind had not yet agreed to fail with it. The pages where he had stopped recording observations and had begun in his careful, deliberate way to write down what he believed. She had read these pages so many times that she knew them the way, a landscape you have walked in all weathers, not just their content, but their texture, the particular quality of attention that each passage required, the places where she always slowed down and the places where she always stopped entirely. One passage she had marked in the first week after his death, before the bank, before the foreclosure, before any of what followed, marked with a small pencil line in the margin, the notation of a woman who recognized something important and wanted to be able to find it again. She read it now on a January evening, many years after the blizzard, with the wind in the pines outside and the walls of her house breathing their patient warmth around her and the candle steady on the table because no draft reached it here. The mountain does not fight the winter. It does not rage against the cold or throw its heat away in the effort of resistance. It simply holds the memory of the sun deep within its stone, and it waits. In the waiting is everything. The mountain is not passive, it is patient. There is a difference that matters more than any other difference I know. The passive thing accepts its fate. The patient thing holds its purpose through whatever comes and is ready when the season turns. She read it through once. Then she sat with it for a while the way she sat with everything that mattered, not analyzing it, not extracting from it the specific application of its wisdom, just letting it be present with her in the warm room, the way a good companion is present, without requiring anything. She thought about Edwin. She thought about the way he had held his purpose through the years of the mine and the cough and the slow diminishment of his body, not passively, not accepting what was coming, without effort, but patiently continuing to observe and record and think and sketch and refine, continuing to be the thing he was right up to the moment he was not. She thought about his hands on this journal. She thought about the way he had sat at their kitchen table with the pages spread before him, that particular brightness in his eyes. She folded the journal closed. She placed her hand on the wall beside her chair, a habit now so deeply habitual that she sometimes did it without noticing, the way you reach for a familiar object in the dark and find it without looking. The wall was warm. It was always warm. 6 weeks in a hole in the ground during the worst blizzard in 20 years had established something in the stone and earth that time had only deepened a thermal history, an accumulated record of 10,000 small fires, each one paying its rent before it was allowed to go. The wall held the memory of every winter she had lived in this place. It held the heat of every summer that had found its way through the south-facing glass and down into the earth. It held, in the language of temperature and mass, in the slow physics of stored energy, the full account of her years here. Not a monument, not a memorial, something more alive than that. Something that was still doing the work it had been built to do, still accepting what was given, and returning it slowly, patiently, without waste. The smoke had paid its rent. It had paid it every day for all the years since the first fire, and the interest had compounded in ways that no ledger in the Dakota Territorial Bank and Trust had ever been designed to record. Outside, the January wind moved through the pines on the ridge with its old searching voice, the voice that in her first years here had seemed to her like a threat, the sound of something that wanted to take from her the little she had left. She understood it differently now. It was not a threat. It was simply the world being itself, large and cold and utterly indifferent, going about its ancient business with no particular opinion about the small, warm places that the living carved out within it. She was one of those small, warm places. She had built herself into one with a pickaxe and a dead man's drawings, and the specific courage that belongs not to people who are unafraid, but to people who are afraid and continue anyway because the thing they are trying to do is more important than their fear. She had built it out of nothing, out of a crate of objects, in a winter, in an idea that everyone around her had called a folly, and it had held and it had spread, and the warmth of it was still here, still real, still radiating from walls that the earth had charged across an uncountable number of patient days. She did not need the world to know this. The warmth knew it. The walls knew it. The families in their Welsh method houses knew it, most of them, in the way that people know the things that keep them alive, not always consciously, not always with the full articulation of gratitude, but in the body, in the specific quality of comfort that comes from a warmth that does not require constant tending, that is there when you wake in the night without asking anything of you. That was enough. That had always been enough. She stood up from her chair the way an older woman stands, carefully with attention to the body's current terms of agreement, and she carried Edwin's journal to the small shelf where it lived between two books he had also loved, and she set it in its place. She checked the damper on the stove, just barely open. A handful of coals, the fire reduced to its minimum, the system needing almost nothing to continue doing everything. She checked the fresh air pipe at the floor, the small diameter pipe that brought outside air through the earth before delivering it to the room, pre-warmed, clean, arriving without violence. A faint, steady breath. The earth-lung breathing. She blew out the candle. In the darkness, the warmth of the walls was, if anything, more present, perceptible, in a way that light somehow competed with the radiation of stored heat, registering more clearly when there was nothing else to register. She stood for a moment in the dark room and let it be around her, this warmth that she had built, and the earth had held, and Edwin had first imagined in the compacted, careful script of a man who knew he was not going to have as much time as he needed, and was trying to put down as much as he could before the time ran out. She was not waiting anymore. She had not been waiting for a long time. She had taken what the winter gave her, and she had held it, and she had used it, and she had passed it on, not in a journal. Not yet, though. The journal Nora had given her was nearly full. Now full of her own observations and refinements, and the specific knowledge that came from having built the thing, rather than only having imagined it. She had passed it on in the way that the earth passes on warmth, slowly through contact without drama, degree by degree, until the thing being warmed holds enough of it to warm the next thing in turn. That was how knowledge moved when it moved well. That was how it survived. She walked to her bed in the warm dark in the house that the earth held, in the valley where the winter was still the winter and always would be, vast and cold and absolute and utterly indifferent, but where the people who lived in it had learned, because a miner's wife had been desperate enough and brave enough and patient enough to show them, that the cold was not the enemy. Waste was the enemy. Ignorance was the enemy. The cold was simply the teacher, the hard, reliable, non-negotiable teacher that the territory had always provided free of charge to anyone willing to learn its lesson. The mountain does not fight the winter. Marin Howell had learned this. She had built it into stone and earth and the walls of 100 warm homes in the valley below. She closed her eyes, the walls held.